Dr. Staples, it's Brandon. Just wanted to thank you for the 2 weeks of the Urban Seminar, and here's my final project, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you like it, and give me an A. The one word when it comes to this seminar that I learned and that I'm going to incorporate is respect. And early on when I thought about teaching, I always wondered how I could be friends with my students or be friendly with my students. And I soon realized that this isn't the best way to handle the situation, and it's all around respect. I learned from my teacher through her students that you don't mess with Mrs. Rooney, which is my proctor teacher. My students told me that they respected her because she was firm and fair, and that they knew that there would be consequences if they were out of line. They knew that if they bad talked her, or they were cursing, or they would say unpolite comments, that it would result in a call home, and if they were on their cell phone, she would be taking it away. So I can learn a lot from that, and now the students respected her, and once you gain the students' respect, then in turn they'll respect you as a teacher. And I do think that is important to build relationships with the students and not just be a dictator and authoritarian. But if you're too friendly with their students, I think that they're going to take advantage of you, and that's something that I wanted to shy away from, which is why I wanted to base my word around respect, because I'm going to set high expectations for them, and I want my students to know that I'm going to be fair, firm, and consistent with my guidelines. When it comes to something that I've learned from gender and sexism, race and racism, and ableism, I'd have to say that the biggest thing I learned was to watch what I say and the actions that I do. The course gave me an eye-opening experience to what goes on and what is right and wrong. For an example, for race and racism, I didn't realize that African American students were suspended higher than white students for committing the same crime, or committing the same crime but the same infraction. And something that I learned was that you can't be quick to assume something. So just because a student is African American doesn't mean that they're a bad kid and should have this harsh treatment, and just because they're white doesn't mean that they're a good student and that they should get off as easy, and that everybody should be treated as equals. So moving on to gender and sexism, I learned how teachers can affect students' learning. And reading an article, I saw how students tend to push boys towards math and science and don't tend to do the same thing for girls. And that was a shock to me, because I wrote in one of my previous assignments that math and science were never my strong suits, and on multiple occasions that I had to actually go to girls for help in those certain subjects and certain problems that I was having. And in fact, my one tutor in high school was a woman, and she helped me in science and math. So as a future teacher, I want to just be able to push my students to what they like and what they enjoy, and not what society tends to push them towards. So that is something I learned in regards to gender and sexism. And when it comes to ableism, I learned to minimize the awkward moments. I never even thought about, in regards to a deaf person, that I should talk directly to them, even though they might not be able to hear what I say. If I talk to their aide, it's considered a sign of disrespect. And I never thought of that before I watched those videos in class and we talked about it inside class. I never thought that that would have been an issue, but apparently it is. And I would also want to make sure that in my classroom, if we're watching a video or watching something on TV, I always put on closed captions so that the deaf child could have the same experience as all the other students can. And I also learned to never assume to just help somebody with a disability. For example, if somebody's in a wheelchair, I'm usually always the first person. I'm just like, I'll go out of my way to help them out and make sure that they get around safely. But I didn't realize that that is also a sign of disrespect, and that I should always first ask before I just help out, because they might not want any help, and I might just be infringing on what they believe in and what they want to do. So I need to make sure that I always ask permission before I try and help somebody out. In regards to literary-based collaboration, I have to attribute a lot of this to Anna on our assignments, because Anna really nailed me on and just made sure that she got the best out of me when it came to my assignments, because I always thought that I was putting putting forth great material and I was expecting to get an A, then I'd get B pluses, and I'd have to read her comments to realize why I wasn't getting as good a grade as I should. The first thing that I want to dive into is the attention to detail in the rubric. The first couple of assignments, I'd get off a lot of points because I wouldn't follow just the little stuff, like the font size, the different types of fonts, or how big the font was. And Anna would always make sure to get rid of points when I was out of line. And I just didn't bat an eye on it just because I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but it is a big deal, and I'm sure that other teachers wouldn't have been as nice as Anna, would even deduct even more points on me if I would do that in that classroom. So I have to attribute Anna in my regards to the attention to detail in that subject. Second thing that I learned was to always ask more questions. There's always a new topic that I have to open my mind to, and Anna always said that on every single assignment, that I had to ask more questions and develop different topics and different ideas. And in the last one, I finally got it. I ended up getting an A on it because I asked the right questions. I asked a handful of questions, and she just made sure, she just hammered away at me until I got all of this correct and got it to the way that I should. So I attribute a lot to that, to Anna and to everybody else. And lastly, what I've learned was that to always get more than one perspective. Just because I'm writing the paper doesn't mean that I was the only person there. So if I'm just using if I'm just telling you what I saw, then that might have not been exactly what went on. So it's always a good idea to get different perspectives from other people. Like, I tried to incorporate my teacher and my students in different actions that went on in the classroom. Like in regards to gender and sexism, I wrote about how in the classroom this one student said that Joan of Arc was insane because she was a woman. And I got my teacher's perspective about it. I said my own perspective about how it wasn't right. She said it wasn't right. And now I had the female students. I asked that, like, I just could tell by their reactions and whether they laughed or they were getting on that kid about saying that comment, about how they felt about the subject. So now you have three different perspectives, which I think leads a lot to it. Lastly, what I want to talk about is the 4 agreements and what I've learned from them. First of which is to be impeccable with your word. I now think more about using different types of words and regarding different people because of what I've learned from you in this class. I've learned to stay away from the always, the nevers, the troublemakers, because once you deem that on a student, it can really shake up their confidence and they might never get back from that, and you might not get to the most of their ability because you're always using them and stereotyping them into their little web, which is bad and is detrimental to learning, which is something that being impeccable with your word, I've learned. Secondly is don't make any assumptions. I learned this from mostly my proctor teacher, because when I went in there and I was talking to her and going into different classes, she would tell me about the troublemakers in some groups, and I could have easily just been like, okay, they're a troublemaker, I'm not going to try and help them out. But I didn't, because of what I've learned from you and what you've been telling us. And I made sure that I went up, introduced myself, talked to them, and when we had to do work, I made sure to push them to do their work like everybody else and try to get the most out of them. And I soon realized that they're smart kids, and they did their work, but they just needed somebody to push them a little bit and not just go over them and just not make the assumption and give the stereotype and not try to work with them at all. You need to always push your students, which is what I've learned from this. Thirdly is to don't take anything personally. I try to always just laugh things off if people are making snide comments about me or something like that. It was how I was raised. I usually don't take anything personally. But when I went to the urban seminar, for the first time we talked about this briefly in class, it seemed as if I was the minority because I was a white male and there weren't a lot of white people at the school. So when students would block me about being white or the clothes I wore or the dialect that I had, I made sure I didn't take that personally, because maybe there was something going on in their lives that made them want to try and act out and be humorous with me. And you know, that's fine. That's a different way if somebody helps coping with different ideas. I do that sometimes. I'm sure a lot of people do it. And if people really were getting on my case, maybe you give a little bit of humor back, because humor is a good way to detract the situation and to try to ease the situation and calm people down, which is what I think is good. And lastly, I learned to always do your best. I've always, since I've been raised, been a hard worker, and I've always shot to do my best, whether it came to sports, working out, school, this seminar, and hopefully in my future professor as a teacher. I want to do my best and try my best, because if you're not doing your best as your teacher, how do you expect the students to do the best in your classroom? Which I think is a main focus, because I want to be able to do my best and push my students to do what they can do and get an A and hopefully go into college and live a lovely and happy life the way that I've been able to. So I think that wraps up my final presentation, Dr. Staples. I want to thank you again for a great 2 weeks. I really appreciate it, and I hope to talk and hear from you soon and future in Penn State. Thanks again. I'll see you later.